You've been giving your best, praying faithfully, walking in obedience, and suddenly they start leaving. Friends, mentors, even people in your church, the ones you trusted most, they vanish from your life. And it hits like a punch. Why now? Why me? You start questioning everything, your choices, your faith, even God's love. But what if I told you that every door that closes, every person that walks away, isn't rejection, it's preparation? That the very absence you're grieving is actually God making space for your elevation. Tonight, you're about to see why the ones who leave are not your loss. They're your launch. And the next chapter is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about timing, trust, and destiny. The door that closes with a name and a face. At first, he didn't recognize it as God at work. It felt like one of those awkward seasons you try to explain away. Busy schedules, misunderstandings, life happening. But slowly, conversations cooled. Invitations stopped coming. Even people from church, people who once prayed beside him, began acting as if he wasn't really there anymore. And it hurt. It hurt because he was doing the right things, praying more, fasting, seeking Jesus with sincerity. And yet the deeper he went with God, the more people seemed to drift away. One question kept circling his heart. If I'm obeying, why am I losing? One night, the weight finally broke him. He knelt down, Bible open, but words refused to line up. Prayer turned into tears, not anger, confusion. Lord, what did I do wrong? He whispered. And in the quiet that followed, not empty but searching, something shifted. Proverbs 16:9 stopped sounding like a quote and started sounding like truth. A man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps, even when those steps walk straight through goodbyes he never asked for. Over time, an uncomfortable realization surfaced. Some of those connections weren't just relationships, they were emotional anchors. Approval had become fuel. Belonging had quietly turned into identity. Without noticing, he had placed people where only God should stand. That's not easy to admit. But how often do we call it friendship when it's really fear of being alone? How many decisions are shaped more by validation than by the quiet leading of the Holy Spirit? As those people faded out of his life, clarity slowly replaced confusion. God wasn't rejecting him. God was repositioning him. Where he was being led, those relationships couldn't follow. Not because they were evil, but because they were heavy. Anchors work in harbors, but they will drown you in open water. And for the first time, he understood that some doors don't close out of cruelty, but out of protection. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but it gained meaning. He realized that sometimes God closes doors with names, memories, and shared history attached. Not to empty your heart, but to free it. That tear-filled prayer became an act of surrender, and a quiet certainty settled in. When God removes someone, it isn't abandonment, it's alignment. Let me ask you something. Have you ever lost people right when you decided to go deeper with God? The gardener's cut. At first it felt excessive. Too much loss in too little time. One person leaving might have made sense, but this felt like layers being stripped away. A mentor became distant. A close friend slowly disengaged. A relationship that once felt safe grew cold and unresponsive. It was as if God wasn't just adjusting his life, he was subtracting aggressively. And the thought crept in, quietly but persistently. Why would God take so much from someone who's trying to do right? That question followed him everywhere. In moments of prayer, it lingered. During worship, it distracted. In silence, it grew louder. The fear underneath it was simple and human. What if I end up alone? Not alone in a dramatic sense, but alone in the everyday ways that matter. No one to call, no one to sit beside, no one to say, I see what God is doing in you. Loss has a way of making faith feel fragile, even when belief remains intact. That's when the image of a vineyard began to make sense. Jesus' words in John 15:2 resurfaced, slow and deliberate. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Not the dead branches, the living ones, the productive ones. Pruning isn't punishment, it's precision. A gardener cuts back what's growing because he sees what could grow next. But standing in the middle of that process, it never feels strategic, it just feels painful. Memories started replaying like fragments of an unfinished story. Old messages left on read, familiar names no longer appearing on his phone. Empty space where connection used to sit. And in those moments, the temptation was strong to interpret absence as failure. To believe that if people were leaving, something must be wrong with him. But pruning doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is valuable enough to be protected. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to notice a shift inside himself. Without the constant feedback loop of approval, his faith grew quieter, but stronger. He prayed without an audience, obeyed without applause, showed up consistently even when no one noticed, and that's when maturity started to take root. Fruit that doesn't depend on recognition lasts longer. Growth that isn't fueled by validation goes deeper. There were moments he wanted to resist the process, to reach back out, to reattach what God was clearly removing. But every time he tried, peace slipped away, and that absence of peace became its own answer. The gardener wasn't being cruel, he was being intentional, cutting back what drained strength so that what remained could thrive. And somewhere in that quiet resistance, understanding formed. God wasn't trying to reduce his life. He was preparing it for weight it couldn't yet carry. Pruning always looks like loss before it looks like increase. But the cut is never the end of the story. Have you ever felt like God was taking too much, only to realize later he was making room for more? When their exit is God's answer. He had prayed for clarity more times than he could count. Not dramatic prayers, honest ones, simple ones. God, show me what to do. Lord, if this isn't from you, remove it. He expected direction to come as a feeling, maybe a verse highlighted in his Bible, or a sudden sense of certainty. What he didn't expect was silence, followed by separation. One by one, people started walking away. No arguments, no explanations, just distance. And at first it felt like prayer had gone unanswered. The confusion deepened because the timing made no sense. These were people he loved, people he trusted, people he assumed would walk with him into whatever God had next. So when they left, his instinct was to look inward. Did I say something wrong? Did I change too much? Should I have stayed quieter? That night he scrolled through old conversations, rereading messages, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things shifted. Loss has a way of making you interrogate yourself. That's when the story of Acts 16 came to mind. Paul wanted to go one way, Asia, then Bithynia. Both doors closed, not because Paul lacked faith, but because God had another direction entirely. The redirection didn't come with a detailed explanation. It came through blocked paths. Only later did Macedonia appear, and suddenly, what felt like delay revealed itself as guidance. God hadn't ignored Paul's prayer. He had answered it through closed doors. That realization landed slowly. What if the exits weren't rejection, but response? What if God had answered his prayer, just not in the form he expected? We often confuse human presence with divine approval. When people stay, we assume God is pleased. When they leave, we assume something went wrong. But sometimes God removes voices because they can't speak into the next season without distorting it. There was grief in that understanding, because loving people deeply doesn't make their departure hurt less. It hurts more, and yet, beneath the ache, peace began to surface. Not relief, clarity. God wasn't dismantling his life, he was rearranging it. The season had shifted, and those relationships belonged to an earlier chapter. Trying to carry them forward would have kept him anchored to a version of himself God was finished refining. He realized something else too. Growth creates distance without intention. When you mature, your language changes, your priorities shift, your convictions sharpen. And sometimes people don't walk away because you failed. They walk away because you outgrew the space where the relationship was built. That doesn't make them wrong. It just makes the season complete. And in that moment, the prayer finally made sense. God had answered, decisively, lovingly, firmly, not by adding something new yet, but by removing what no longer aligned. Direction didn't arrive as a signpost, it arrived as a goodbye. Have you ever realized that what felt like loss was actually God clearing the path forward? The loyalty test. Who loves you without using you? As he continued forward, something uncomfortable became impossible to ignore. The crowd thinned. Not suddenly, gradually. When he stayed quiet, everyone was around. When he agreed with everything, laughter came easy. But the moment he chose integrity over convenience, obedience over popularity, the atmosphere changed. Smiles became forced, support became conditional. And slowly he realized something few are prepared to face. Not everyone who walks with you is walking for you. He felt that tension deeply. There were moments he caught himself over-explaining, apologizing for growth he didn't need to apologize for. He replayed conversations in his head, wondering how to say things differently so people wouldn't feel uncomfortable. That's when the internal conflict sharpened. Do I stay faithful to what God is forming in me, or do I dilute it to stay connected? It's a quiet war, but a costly one. John 6 echoed through his thoughts. The moment Jesus spoke truth that was hard to hear, and many walked away. Not because he lacked love, but because truth demands surrender. Jesus didn't chase the crowd. He turned to the few who remained and asked a piercing question, will you also go away? Loyalty isn't proven when everything feels good. It's revealed when truth disrupts comfort. That realization reframed everything. Some people weren't leaving because he failed them. They were leaving because they couldn't walk with him without benefiting from him. And when usefulness disappears, so does proximity. That's painful to accept, especially when you genuinely cared. But God wasn't exposing this to wound him. He was doing it to protect him. He began to understand that elevation requires discernment, not desperation. God filters relationships not to isolate us, but to purify motive. Those who remain after truth is spoken, after boundaries are drawn, after convenience is removed, those are covenant people, not perfect, but real. And real relationships don't require you to betray who you're becoming. The test wasn't about others leaving. It was about whether he would abandon himself to keep them. And once that became clear, the path forward narrowed, but it also became lighter. Let me ask you honestly, have you ever noticed who stayed when you stopped being useful? Take a moment and reflect. Which relationship or connection has God already removed from your life, and how did it hurt at the time? Share it in the comments below. Your story might help someone else see God's purpose in their own season of separation. The desert with no audience. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, like a room emptying without anyone announcing they were leaving. Notifications slowed. Invitations disappeared. The calendar that once felt crowded now had wide, quiet spaces. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least nothing obvious, and yet it felt like God had led him into a place where no one was watching, no one was clapping, and no one was confirming that he was still relevant. That's when the desert made itself known. Not a dramatic wilderness, but an emotional one. Routine days, long evenings, a phone that didn't ring, and the thought that kept tapping his mind was dangerous in its simplicity. If no one sees me, do I still matter? It's a question many people carry but rarely admit, because we've learned to measure importance by visibility, not by obedience. He tried to fill the quiet at first. Background noise, distractions, productivity, even good things can become substitutes when silence feels too honest. But the desert has a way of stripping away what doesn't belong. Eventually, all that remained was him, an open Bible, and a heart that didn't know how to perform without an audience. And that discomfort revealed something important. He had learned how to serve publicly, but not how to rest privately. Scripture began to take on new weight. Israel didn't meet God in the noise of Egypt. Jesus didn't step into ministry before the wilderness. The desert always comes before public impact, not as a delay, but as a filter. It exposes motives, it clarifies identity, it answers the question we avoid asking, who am I, when no one is watching? Some nights, worship felt empty. Some prayers felt mechanical. There were moments when doubt whispered, maybe you missed your moment. But slowly, something deeper began to form. Faith without feedback, obedience without applause, trust without reassurance. He started showing up not because it felt rewarding, but because it was right. And that kind of consistency reshapes a person. In the absence of people, God became louder, not emotionally but clearly. Convictions sharpened, discernment grew. He began to recognize how much noise had been shaping his decisions before. In the desert, there was no one to impress, no one to compete with, no one to explain himself to. Just God forming identity without interruption. The desert didn't feel productive, but it was precise. God wasn't hiding him, he was grounding him, teaching him to be a son before being a reference, to listen before leading, to stand without leaning on validation. And without realizing it, strength was being built that applause could never provide. Let me ask you, how do you handle the seasons where God removes the crowd but keeps the calling alive? The separation that saves the calling. At this stage, the pattern was undeniable. Every time momentum began to build, certain people created friction. Not loud resistance, subtle pullback. Old habits resurfaced around familiar faces. Conversations drifted backward instead of forward. Dreams felt harder to articulate without being minimized or misunderstood. And slowly, a painful awareness surfaced. Some relationships weren't evil, but they were misaligned with where God was taking him. That realization brought guilt with it, a heavy one. Am I being ungrateful? Am I abandoning people who once stood by me? Those questions don't come lightly. They wrestle with compassion, loyalty, and fear of becoming cold-hearted. He didn't want to confuse obedience with arrogance, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Peace kept leaving whenever he stayed connected to what God was clearly asking him to release. The story of Abraham and Lot began to feel uncomfortably personal. Two people called together walking the same road until the land could no longer sustain both. The separation wasn't betrayal. It was necessary for expansion. Abraham didn't argue. He didn't force alignment. He trusted that obedience sometimes requires distance, and only after the separation did God speak clearly again about the promise. That truth hit close to home. Some people in his life weren't pushing him towards sin outright. They were pulling him back into cycles God had already broken. Familiar humor, old coping mechanisms, subtle compromises that didn't look dangerous until they stacked up. And the calling inside him struggled to breathe in those environments, not because he lacked discipline, but because proximity shapes appetite. The breaking point didn't come with drama. It came quietly, polite conversations, gentle distance, no slammed doors. Just a deep internal war between love and obedience. He learned that you can care deeply for someone and still need separation. That love doesn't always mean access, and that peace is often the clearest confirmation that alignment has been restored. When the separation finally settled, something unexpected happened. Temptation lost its grip. Focus sharpened, energy returned. The calling felt lighter, not because it became easier, but because resistance was removed. It became clear that God hadn't taken people away to punish him. He had done it to protect what was forming. The separation didn't erase memories or affection, but it created space. Space for healing, space for clarity, space for the calling to breathe without being pulled backward. And without realizing it, he stepped into a version of freedom he couldn't have reached while holding on. Let me ask you, have you ever felt God asking you to let go, not because something was bad, but because it was holding you back? God's elevator doesn't rise with emotional baggage. By now, he could feel it, the upward pull. Not externally, not visibly, but internally. A quiet sense that God was preparing something higher, heavier, more demanding. And yet every time that sense surfaced, fear followed close behind. Because elevation sounds exciting until you realize it requires release. And what he was still carrying wasn't sin. It was emotional weight, the need to be accepted, the fear of being misunderstood, the habit of holding on to people who no longer had access to his future. That's when the image became clear. An elevator. Smooth, steady, designed to rise, but only within its limits. Elevators don't fail because they can't go up. They fail because they're overloaded. And suddenly, he understood why things kept stalling. It wasn't resistance from the outside. It was weight from the inside, emotional baggage disguised as loyalty, attachment disguised as love, fear disguised as compassion. There were moments when he almost reached back. His fingers hovered over messages never sent. He typed, deleted, retyped. He stood near doors he knew God had already closed, convincing himself that one more conversation might bring peace. But every attempt came with the same result. Tension, not clarity. Anxiety, not rest. The Spirit wasn't condemning him, just quietly asking, "Why are you carrying what I already asked you to leave behind?" Letting go didn't feel holy at first. It felt like loss, like failure, like choosing isolation. But slowly he noticed something shift. The silence felt lighter. His prayers felt less crowded. Decisions came with less internal debate. The empty space he feared didn't stay empty. It became available. Available for healing, for clarity, for God's presence to fill what people once occupied. He began to understand that God never removes people to shame us. He removes them to heal us, to expose wounds we kept numbing with relationships, to confront fears we buried under busyness and connection. The baggage wasn't evil, but it was unnecessary. And elevation doesn't require perfection, it requires freedom. The higher God lifts you, the more clarity you need. And clarity doesn't coexist well with emotional chaos. God wasn't stripping him down for humiliation. He was lightening the load so the ascent wouldn't break him. What felt like emptiness was actually preparation, space being made for strength he hadn't needed before. And in that realization, something settled deep within him. He wasn't losing everything. He was finally traveling light. Let me ask you, what are you still carrying that God may be asking you to put down before the next rise? The betrayal that wakes you up. He didn't see it coming. That was the hardest part. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It arrives dressed as trust, disguised as loyalty, wrapped in familiar smiles. One moment, everything felt stable. The next, a word slipped, a truth surfaced. A line was crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. And suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was disorienting. Because when betrayal comes from someone close, it doesn't just break trust, it shakes perception. The first reaction wasn't spiritual, it was human. Anger rose fast. Questions followed. How could they do this? Why would God allow it? He replayed conversations, moments of laughter, shared prayers, trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the wound now in front of him. Betrayal has a way of making you doubt your discernment, your judgment, even your faith. And in the quiet moments, resentment whispered solutions that felt powerful but poisoned. Joseph's story surfaced, not as a distant Bible lesson, but as a mirror. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold, silenced, forgotten. Not because he was careless, but because God had placed something on his life they couldn't carry. Joseph didn't provoke the betrayal. His calling exposed it. And what was meant to destroy him became the very road that led him to purpose. God didn't approve the betrayal, but he governed the outcome. That distinction mattered. God doesn't partner with evil, he overrules it. The pain was real, the injustice undeniable. But the betrayal wasn't the end of the story. It was a wake-up call, a brutal one. It exposed who had access they were never meant to keep. It revealed loyalties built on proximity, not covenant. And as painful as that realization was, it brought clarity no comfort ever could. Forgiveness didn't come easily. It wasn't instant. Some prayers were interrupted by anger. Some worship moments were cut short by memory. But slowly, the Spirit reframed the moment. Holding on to bitterness would chain him to the very thing meant to release him. Forgiveness wasn't excusing what happened. It was choosing not to let it define the future. He began to see that betrayal accelerates separation. It forces decisions we might postpone forever. It pushes clarity into the open, and while the wound hurt, it also woke something up. Discernment sharpened, boundaries strengthened, vision clarified. He wasn't the same after that moment, and he wasn't meant to be. The betrayal didn't destroy his faith. It refined it. It didn't derail the calling. It redirected it. What was meant to break him became the very pressure that pushed him forward. Let me ask you, has a painful betrayal ever revealed a truth you couldn't see any other way? God protects your future by removing your now. What hurt the most wasn't what he lost. It was when he lost it. The timing felt cruel. These were people he wanted in his future, not leftovers from his past. He could still see the potential, still imagine them walking beside him in what God was building. That's what made the removal feel unbearable. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't conflict. It was attachment. And God was touching the very things he loved. He tried to hold on anyway, just a little longer. One more conversation, one more attempt to explain himself, one more chance to make it work. He told himself it was wisdom, maturity, grace. But deep down, he knew. He was fighting a process that had already been decided. Every attempt to revive what was fading left him drained, restless, uneasy. Peace had become the first thing to disappear. That's when Jeremiah 29:11 began to sound different. Not comforting, confronting. I know the plans I have for you. Plans meant God was already ahead of him, already seeing consequences he couldn't yet imagine, already aware of future pressures his current relationships wouldn't survive. What felt like loss in the present was protection for what was coming next. God sees what certain connections would cost you later, the compromises they'd require, the delays they'd introduce, the confusion they'd normalize. What you love today can quietly sabotage tomorrow if it doesn't align with where you're going. And God doesn't improvise with destinies. He guards them, even when guarding looks like separation. The tension grew stronger the more he resisted. He felt it during prayer, during sleep, during moments when he tried to convince himself this was temporary. And then clarity arrived, firm but gentle. I'm not taking from you, I'm keeping you. That sentence settled deep. God wasn't reacting emotionally, he was acting intentionally. Letting go felt like grief because it was grief. He mourned what could have been. He mourned the version of the future he had imagined. But grief doesn't mean disobedience. Sometimes it's simply the cost of trusting a God who sees beyond today. The tears didn't mean he doubted God, they meant he cared deeply. And slowly, as resistance softened, peace returned. Not excitement, not answers, peace, the kind that doesn't argue, the kind that confirms alignment even when emotions lag behind. God wasn't cruel, he was careful, protecting a future that hadn't arrived yet by removing what couldn't go with him. Let me ask you, is there something God might be removing now because he knows where you're headed next? If this part of the story is resonating with you, pause for a second and like the video. It helps others discover encouragement and the reminder that God is working even in loss, when God changes your circle to change your destination. At some point, he noticed something subtle but undeniable. His inner world was changing, but his environment hadn't caught up yet. Conversations that once felt normal now felt heavy. Jokes that used to be harmless started feeding anxiety. Certain gatherings left him drained instead of strengthened. It wasn't about morality anymore. It was about direction. The people around him weren't pulling him into obvious failure, but they weren't pulling him forward either. That realization was unsettling because familiarity feels like safety. Staying with the same circle meant predictability. Leaving it meant uncertainty. He wondered if something was wrong with him for feeling out of place. Why don't I fit anymore? But growth often creates friction before it creates alignment. When your values evolve, your environment either adjusts or resists. Then new people began to appear. Not dramatically, quietly. Different tone, different priorities. Conversations centered less on comparison and more on purpose. Less on complaining and more on responsibility. At first he felt small around them, insecure, like he didn't belong in that room. The old voice whispered, "You're not ready for this level," but peace said otherwise. Proverbs 13:20 took on fresh meaning. He who walks with the wise grows wise. Wisdom isn't just knowledge, it's atmosphere. Being around people who stretch your thinking, challenge your faith, and normalize discipline reshapes what you believe is possible. And suddenly, he realized something important. God wasn't punishing him by removing old friends. He was preparing him by introducing new alignment. Still, the transition wasn't easy. There were moments he missed the comfort of being fully known, moments when starting over felt exhausting. Learning new rhythms, new language, new expectations requires humility. But with that humility came expansion. He began to rise to the level of the conversations around him. His faith matured, his thinking sharpened, his vision widened. What he once saw as rejection, he now recognized as redirection. God didn't just remove people, he upgraded perspective. Because destiny isn't shaped only by decisions, it's shaped by voices. And the wrong voices, even well-meaning ones, can quietly keep you circling the same ground. As the new circle formed, something shifted inside him. Anxiety lessened, comparison lost its grip. Purpose felt clearer. God hadn't changed his destination overnight. He had changed the environment that would carry him there. Let me ask you, who are the voices shaping your direction right now? The secret place where only the heart remains. Before anything visible changed, God shifted the location of the work. Not outward, inward. Movement slowed, opportunities paused, invitations faded. It felt like life narrowed into a smaller, quieter space. Not because momentum was lost, but because noise was being removed. He noticed that fewer people had access to him now, and fewer opinions were shaping his decisions. It wasn't isolation, it was intention. At first, the stillness frustrated him. He knew he had more to give, more to build, more to offer. Watching others move ahead stirred impatience. I could be doing more, he thought. I should be further by now. But Matthew 6:6 began to echo differently. The reminder that God rewards what is formed in secret, not what is displayed in public. Visibility wasn't the goal right now. Depth was. The secret place has a way of confronting motives. Without an audience, excuses lose power. There's no applause to chase, no reputation to manage, just obedience, raw and unfiltered. Some prayers felt unfinished. Some days felt unproductive. But something steady was happening beneath the surface. God was shaping character that wouldn't collapse under pressure later. He began to notice how often he had confused activity with fruitfulness. Doing more doesn't always mean becoming more. In the quiet, he learned to listen instead of rush, to obey without needing confirmation, to sit with questions instead of forcing answers. The secret place wasn't exciting, but it was clarifying. There were moments when comparison tried to creep back in. He saw others advancing publicly while he felt hidden. But God wasn't delaying him, he was anchoring him. Foundations don't attract attention, they carry weight. And what God was preparing him to hold required strength that only comes from private formation. And without announcing it, God was doing something irreversible. He wasn't preparing him to be seen, he was preparing him to stand. When the doors opened again, he wouldn't be fragile, he would be rooted. Let me ask you, how do you respond when God invites you into silence instead of visibility, elevation that still hurts, missing what God removed? By the time elevation became visible, he expected the pain to disappear. Promotion, recognition, progress. Surely those things would erase the ache, but they didn't. Instead, success arrived with a quiet contradiction. He was standing in answered prayers while still grieving unanswered expectations. There were moments of honor where joy rose and then stalled because someone he expected to be there wasn't. That absence hit hardest in moments meant to be shared. A breakthrough phone call, a door opening, a season finally shifting. Instinctively, he looked to the side and felt the gap. People God had removed weren't there to witness what God was now doing, and that triggered guilt. Why do I miss them if God took them? Does missing them mean I'm ungrateful? He wrestled with that tension quietly. Because elevation doesn't cancel emotion, it exposes it. Maturity doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means you learn where to take your feelings. He realized something important in those moments. God never promised that obedience would make loss painless. He promised it would make it purposeful. David came to mind, anointed king long before the crown ever rested on his head. Elevated in calling, yet still hunted, misunderstood, alone. God's favor didn't spare him from grief. It sustained him through it. And suddenly, that reframed everything. Missing people didn't mean God was wrong. It meant the heart was human. There were moments he questioned himself, wondered if holding space for grief meant he hadn't fully surrendered. But surrender isn't emotional amnesia. It's alignment. He learned that you can honor what was without returning to it. You can miss people without reopening doors. God closed for your protection. God's presence became gentler in this season, less instructional, more comforting, not correcting the grief, holding it. I didn't take from you, God seemed to whisper. I led you. And that distinction mattered, because theft wounds, guidance heals, even when it hurts. Elevation didn't erase the past, it clarified it. He wasn't longing for the relationships themselves. He was mourning the version of the future he imagined with them in it. And letting that go was part of becoming whole at this level. Let me ask you, have you ever felt grateful for where God took you, while still missing who couldn't come with you? Elevation doesn't erase the past, it clarifies it. Every person God removed, every door that closed, every season of silence was shaping you, preparing you, refining your heart. You've learned that being alone doesn't mean being abandoned, and that absence can be the clearest sign of presence. The very moments that hurt the most are the ones teaching the deepest lessons about trust, obedience, and identity in God. Take a moment and ask yourself, who has God removed from your life to elevate you? How has His hand been guiding you even when you felt alone? Share your reflections in the comments or like this message if it resonated. Let's grow together in understanding His purposes. And if you think this story ends here, wait until the next video. We'll dive into how God orchestrates your relationships, timing, and opportunities to position you exactly where He wants you, for the destiny He's been preparing all along. The next chapter is coming, and it will challenge everything you think you know about His timing.